podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Maxwell's House is brought to you by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Maxwell's House with Ray Maxwell and Dr. Kiki Sanford, episode 64, Physics Across Different Technologies.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Maxwell's House. I'm Dr. Kiki here with Ray Maxwell for episode 64, Physics Across Many Technologies. I hope you all enjoy the show. And Ray, what did you bring for us today? What are we going to be talking about?
Well, we're going to cover several things. We're going to talk a little bit about, I've got the aviation news, and I want to make an announcement. Next Saturday here in Vancouver, British Columbia at UBC, there is a Skepticamp. I don't know whether you've heard about these, but they're a meeting of skeptics and science, people who promote science. And it's going to be out at UBC. And if you're interested, check it out at vancouver.skepticamp.org. So that's vancouver.skepticamp.org, skepticamp.org.
Yeah, there seem to be a lot of these coming out and about. There's a Sacramento area skeptic camp. I think they're calling it Skeptical, like for Northern California Skeptics Conference coming up here in a little bit. I know there are some prominent web skeptics who will be speaking. I think I'm going to be on a panel, moderating a panel, maybe speaking. I don't know what I'm doing yet. I need to pay more attention to these things. Talking about critical thinking and the media. So we have Victoria, British Columbia, and
Vancouver.
Vancouver and Sacramento.
Right.
Coming up.
Yeah. So I'm going to be late, but I am going to show up there as soon as I can. I have another meeting at 10 o'clock. It starts at 10, but it runs to 6 p.m., so it's all day.
Great.
Yeah.
A full day of skepticism.
That's right.
I don't know. Does that sound like fun to you?
Well, the last one I went to was quite fun. So, I was quite pleased. The speakers they had and the discussion. And it's kind of whoever shows up are the speakers. I mean, they do invite a few people and make sure they have some speakers, but you'll certainly have a chance to give your own opinion and whatnot, and you can volunteer to give a talk if you like. So it's a real exchange of ideas and very open exchange. So.
Yeah, everyone's asking once again for the URL. If you could say that one more time.
Yes, it's just put into your URL, just put in Vancouver, VANCOUVER, .skepticamp, SKEPTICAMP.org. And it's actually, it's not, I don't know whether, there you got it. It's HTTP and then, but if you just type in vancouver.skepticamp.org, it'll take you there.
Exciting. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. So after the announcements, what comes next?
Well, the next thing comes aviation in the news. And there's a story in the news, a very tragic story, but one I can't pass up because it's so incredibly unusual. It's one of those 1 in a billion accidents. Yeah. I don't know whether you've heard about it, but a man was running down the beach in Hilton Head, South Carolina, and an aircraft who had lost power. In fact, it lost its propeller and was making a forced landing on the beach, and the runner was running away from the direction of the airplane, so he couldn't possibly see it coming. And he had earplugs in, so he couldn't hear it. But keep in mind, there was no engine running. So there was no sound other than the sounds of gliding coming from the aircraft.
Oh, my gosh.
And the windshield had been covered in oil due to, what happened originally was this plane was up at 13,000 feet, and it lost oil pressure, and it's a turbine engine. with a variable pitch propeller, and an oil leak developed, and the oil covered the windshield of the plane, so it was very difficult for the pilot to see forward out of the plane. And he tried to make it to one of the local airports, but found out he wasn't able to glide to that airport. And so he lined up on a beach, because one of the nice things about a beach, if you have to do a forced landing, and you can't see forward, is you can see land on your left or right, and water on the opposite side. And so you can kind of line up without looking directly straight forward. And this is what he did. And he and his passenger did escape with no damage. There was serious damage to the plane, but unfortunately they could not see the man running down the beach.
And if they could, was there anything that they could do about it? Is that something they could have avoided him? Yeah,
he could have gone, left or right, onto the beach more or out into the water. I'm sure he wouldn't have just, if I were a pilot coming in that situation and I saw someone at the last minute, I would try and avoid them. I think, but since he couldn't see forward out of the aircraft, he couldn't see the guy. And, it was a tragic accident. The gentleman that was running on the beach was killed.
Yeah, it seems as though the lesson here, though, is maybe earbud headphones.
Well,
the man jogging was wearing earbud headphones and probably in his own little jogging world and didn't have any clue what was coming.
Right. And even if there were other persons on the beach who might have seen this coming and shouted, he might not have been able to hear them.
Yeah.
So that's definitely true. There is a risk anytime you cut off your awareness of your surroundings. We've all done it. I mean, I'm wearing earbuds right now, monitoring this, but hopefully
no plane comes crashing into your office.
Hopefully in the basement of my home, I'm reasonably safe.
Yeah, we can hope.
They've got to come through an awful lot of structure to get to me. But it was it's a sad and tragic freak accident.
Completely freak accident. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I will say something about this. This aircraft is quite unusual. It's a Lancair 4P, or Roman numeral IVP. And what it's unusual about, it's a kit. It's a home-built aircraft. You can buy this kit. By the time you finish building this kit, the turbine version of it, there's a piston-powered version and a turbine version, you will have spent somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000.
Wow!
This is a super high performance composite aircraft.
And as far as airplanes go, I mean, what's a reasonable price for an airplane?
Well, most home builts are anywhere from $50,000 to $150,000 nowadays.
Yeah, I was thinking more around there.
This is
up there,
way up there, and a very unusual for a home-built aircraft to have a turbine engine. This aircraft can cruise. Maximum cruise is around 320 knots, which is over almost 600 kilometers per hour.
Yeah,
for the metric crowd.
You Canadians.
Well, I got email about a guy saying, when you fly, you're always talking imperial, and I explained that last session. But because our speeds are in knots and our altitudes are in feet, and that's neither is metric. So, but this aircraft is super high performance. That's a very high cruising speed for most home-built aircraft. Most home-built aircraft are between 100, 200 knots nowadays. And this thing, go 320 knots. I mean, that's an extremely fast kit aircraft.
Yeah.
The other update in aviation news that I wanted to mention is they still haven't found the black box from the Air France 447. This was the aircraft that disappeared over the Atlantic when it was flying from Rio to Paris. And They are still looking for the black box. However, from the ACARS data, this is the digital data transmitted back from the aircraft, they now are fairly certain that the accident has to do with various sensors on the aircraft icing up while going through a severe thunderstorm.
Huh.
And the further complication of that, which goes back to some other discussions we've had here on Maxwell's House, is that this is a fly-by-wire aircraft, very computerized, and when those probes fail, the flight management computer system goes into a fallback mode, and the aircraft controls to the pilot feel different than they do in its normal mode. And several pilots are pointing this out, say that's different from Boeing aircraft, which are not 100% fly-by-wire. But the A320 is 100% fly-by-wire. And when you mess up its sensors, where it can't, and they think the temperature sensor and the pitot tube, which measures airspeed, were both messed up, the thing gets very confused, and the fallback modes, it kind of sneaks up on the pilots. And if they're at a high enough altitude, there's very little difference. It's very hard to find the correct attitude to fly at when those sensors are blinded, because if you go speed up, you'll hit Mach buffet, and if you slow down, you'll stall.
Wait, what was that you just said? You'll hit what?
Mach buffet.
Mach
now
buffet.
That means Mach buffet is what happens when you approach the speed of sound.
Oh.
And most aircraft today, most jets fly at about 0.86 of the speed of sound for the altitude they're flying at. And that speed varies with altitude. So you can get, at high altitudes, you can get into a corner of the flight envelope where if you speed up a little bit, you hit Mach buffet and you start to get this buffeting, this turbulence.
Mm-hmm.
If you slow down, you stall. And sometimes at high altitudes, the difference in those two speeds is less than 50 knots. So you need to maintain a correct attitude in the aircraft very precisely.
Yeah.
And if you lose the instruments showing you that information, you're in serious trouble, and you can lose control of the aircraft, and which is what they believe happened at this point. So that's the aviation news for this week.
Awesome.
And
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that was such a big story when that happened. Everyone's been wondering what possibly could have gone wrong. And I know there was a lot of talk about maybe the composite planes, the way they were built, that maybe certain wind speeds, or that there were certain situations where like the tail might just break off, or that the plane might fall apart at particular speeds or in particular weather situations. And so that kind of became a concern to some people talking about it. But
yeah, now that's more associated with some other accidents rather than this one. They don't think that's what happened in this case.
Right.
But I don't know.
I don't know.
Certainly, there's been a lot of discussion on the 787, the new aircraft that Boeing is flight testing right now, because it has more composite structure than any other aircraft in the air, and there's talks about its resistance to lightning and so forth. So that's a whole nother
That's
discussion.
a whole different bag of worms.
Yeah. The good news is that with all these things that we talk about and all these accidents and so forth, you're still flying in one of the safest modes of transportation on Earth when you go on an airliner. So
Thanks for repeating that. You make me feel much safer in those friendly skies.
Right.
Did you have mail that you were going to bring up for the color?
Yes.
Your color mail?
I got a number of emails asking questions. As a follow-up, I did a 4-program series on different aspects of color science. So I thought I would follow up and fill in a few more details. Now, we're really going to dive deep, but that's what we do on this show. We don't underestimate our audience, and we don't sugarcoat things. We get down deep into the technology and the science of the various aspects of whatever we're discussing. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to jump in. Now, I had several questions from people saying, well, when I look into the settings of my color settings and I choose a profile, for instance, in Photoshop, when I go to print, I have to choose a profile, the working space, and then I have to choose a printer profile that describes the characteristics of the printer I'm going to print to. And then it asks me to choose a rendering intent. So the question is, Ray, what is a rendering intent, and which rendering intent should I use when I print out of Photoshop, for instance? So let me explain what rendering intent is. In each profile, I explained that a profile is a map of the colors that are actually produced for a given device, like a printer or a monitor, when you feed it certain RGB values. In other words, it maps RGB values to LAB values. LAB is a color space, which is a model of human perception. So it turns out that there's not just one table in the profile, there's actually 4 tables in the profile. And each of those is a different rendering intent. And the 4 rendering intents that are available are absolute color metric, relative color metric, saturation, and perceptual. So let me go through each one of those and explain what they are and when you would use them, what would be appropriate time for you to choose one. Now, the first one is in many ways the simplest. It's called absolute color metric. It is used when you want to have one printing system exactly emulate another printing system. For instance, if we are in a print shop and we want to produce a proof on an inkjet printer that will emulate exactly how our printing press will look, we use absolute color metric. What it does is it maps the LAB values from the source space. Let's say we're mapping from Adobe 98 into the printing space. It will do it in absolute terms. In other words, if there's a certain LAB color with 3 LAB values, it will then give you the values that you need to output to this proofing device to make it emulate the press precisely. Now, it has the following shortcomings. First of all, if you're proofing in that and you want it to be accurate, you have to be sure before you begin that the device that you're making the proof on has a larger color gamut than the device you are emulating. Because if the device you're emulating has a larger color space than the proofing device, it will truncate the colors. In other words, if it calls for a color that's outside the color space of the proofing device, it will bring it to the nearest color that it can match it, but it truncates it. So you only use absolute color metric when you have a proofing device that has a larger color gamut than the device that you're trying to emulate. And the other drawback is because our eyes always go to the lightest place in the picture, and we assume that's white, our brain does. And then we read all other colors relative to that. When you use absolute color metric, if the color of the paper that you're trying to emulate in your proof is different from the proofing paper, it will tint, it will put an ink on the paper, very little, but it'll put some ink on there to try and emulate the color of the paper. So the white area of that proof always comes out darker than the actual paper that you're printing on. And so if you don't trim off the excess white paper around the edges, it looks really strange, because your eye will go to that outside paper and say, well, no, this is white, not this tinted area inside the picture that you're saying is white.
Huh. I wonder if there's what's going on there in terms of perception and how the brain works. And
well, the brain always goes to the lightest thing in the picture in front of you, and it says, this must be white. And then it reads all other colors relative to that white. And so that's why when we take a white piece of paper and we look at it under fluorescent light, or we look at it under northern skylight, or we look at it in the light of a sunset, we always see it as white, even though the radiation coming into our eyes is a very different color temperature in those different lightings. So our brain does a white balance, if you please, and adjusts accordingly.
I love it. We have the lens of our eye, and then the I guess the computer that goes behind it is our brain that does all the white balancing and the adjusting. The f-stop is the eye.
Right. All of those adjustments are happening. So we read color in relative terms, not absolute terms. So we have to if we want to emulate a certain paper color, we have to emulate it accurately so that our eye reads all the other colors relative to it. Now, the next rendering intent is relative color metric. Well, what's relative color metric? Well, what it does, and by the way, it is the color rendering intent that you use if you want to print a color image from Photoshop onto your inkjet printer, and you want that print to be as good as it possibly can for that printer. And what it does is it looks at the color of your paper that you're printing on now in your inkjet printer. And it adjusts all the colors relative to that white to make them the correct colors for the color of the paper you're printing on. So that's relative color metric. So relative color metric looks at the color of the paper that you have chosen in your printer, and you've chosen the profile that reflects that color, that paper, and it adjusts all of the colors relative to the white of that paper to make them look correct when viewed relative to the white of your paper. Now, that is the setting that I recommend that you use when you're printing from Photoshop to your normal desktop printer, and you want the maximum color gamut you can get from your printer. You're not trying to emulate any other kind of printing system. Like, you're not trying to make a proof, but you're trying to make the best photograph you can out of Photoshop on your desktop printer. Use relative color metric.
That's good advice.
The next rendering intent that you can select is saturation. Now, saturation, quite often, many of the people who make profiles don't even put in a saturation profile. What it was intended for is if you are printing charts or graphs or vector art and you want the maximum saturated color, you want it to pop off the page, you choose saturation. So in your file, if you have a certain LAB color, it will give you the very maximum saturation used with the same hue of the color in the file that you've supplied. The fourth and last rendering intent is perceptual. Now, perceptual is very interesting. The question comes here, by the way, absolute and relative color metric work very well if the color space that you're coming from is near the same size as the color space that you're printing in or going to. So your source color space and your destination color space, if they're close to the same size, absolute and relative color metric work very well. Perceptual rendering intent, what it does, instead of mapping LAB to LAB, what it does is it takes the most saturated color and the least saturated color, and it proportionally stretches that saturation to fit the destination color space. So in other words, the colors in the final print using perceptual will not be the exact colors they were originally, but they will be proportionally stretched relative to all the colors in the picture to have the same relative position in the color space. So it's a stretching mapping to make the source color space match the output color space. So the output color space can be larger or smaller, and it will proportionally squeeze or expand the colors to fit the output device. Okay? Now now let me tell you the drawback to that.
Yeah. There's a drawback?
There's always a drawback.
No.
All of the other formula for doing absolute colorimetric, relative colorimetry, and saturation are defined by the International Color Consortium, who dreamed up ICC color profiles. That all of those algorithms for doing the mapping and so forth are well defined. So no matter whose profile you use and so forth, you should get the same results. Now I won't go into it. Turns out that's not quite true, but that's the objective. That's where they're trying to get to. But when you use a perceptual rendering intent, perceptual rendering intents are proprietary to the company that made the profile. In other words, if you get a piece of software that makes profile your printer, for instance, the perceptual rendering intent uses proprietary algorithms from the company that wrote the software that you're using, and it doesn't mean that it will be like the proprietary perceptual rendering intent of another software package. So if you're trying to exchange files with other people, it's almost guaranteed if you have a different perceptual profile from another company, it won't look like the one from company A versus company B. So it's proprietary, but it does allow you to map source and destination color profiles in such a way that you can squeeze color into a smaller color space or so forth. So at any rate, that is what rendering intent is. Now, the next question I got connected with this.
Yes.
Now, this next thing is going to sound like a contradiction, but it's not. The next one I got is, well, in my operating system, whether it's Windows or Mac, there's a place where I can select my monitor profile so that my monitor is properly calibrated. But I don't see a place to select the rendering intent. So what's going on here? Why, what rendering intent should I use in my monitor profile? So now I'm going to tell you another carefully guarded secret. Well, it's no secret, but it's not obvious. Monitor profiles only have one rendering intent. And guess what? It's perceptual. Okay? Because what they're trying to do is, no matter what color space you're working in Photoshop, like Adobe 98 or sRGB, they are trying to map it proportionally into your monitor so that on your monitor it looks reasonably proportional in color. So monitor profiles only have one rendering intent, and it's perceptual. Now, the other thing I wanted to say about monitor profiles, because a fellow wrote in and he said, I've been trying different profiles. I don't have a calibration system. And so I just went through and started trying some of the various profiles. And I think the one that looks best is Adobe 98 or sRGB. He chose what are called synthetic editing space profiles. They're not monitor profiles. Adobe 98, sRGB, and ProPhoto, which are the most common editing space profiles, are not suitable to be chosen as monitor profiles, and I'll explain why. Monitor profiles, again, are unique. They only have one rendering intent, and they have a lookup table that calibrates the gamma of your monitor. We now, both Apple and Windows, have now standardized, and this happened fairly recently for Apple, on a gamma of 2.2. So to get your monitor to have that proper gamma, which, by the way, gamma is an adjustment, it's a compression of the scale so that it's non-linear with respect to energy, but it is linear with respect to human perception. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. But there's these lookup tables in a monitor profile that are loaded into your display card that makes your monitor have a certain gamma. And now, like I say, we've standardized on 2.2. Now, what a gamma of 2.2 does is it means that if you were in Photoshop and you make an adjustment of 5 units, let's say you move from 245 to 250 in the highlights, or you move from 5 to 10 in the shadows, you will get the same perceptual change with a gamma of 2.2. If you have any other gamma, that won't be true. So those we've chosen that the gamma of 2.2 so that when you're editing, you get the same result. You know, when you make a certain move in numbers, you get the same result, whether you're in the highlights, the shadows, or the midtones. So that's why we have chosen gamma 2.2. And in the old days, Apple used a gamma of 1.8, and that goes back because the first laser writer that they sold had a gamma of 1.8. And there's, you know, it wasn't a good choice, quite frankly. Now, let me talk a little bit more about these editing space profiles. That's sRGB, Adobe 98, and ProPhoto. They don't represent any real device on Earth. They are idealized color spaces that do have this perceptual linearity. They are chosen in gamut size to match kind of different classes of devices out there. The sRGB originally was chosen to emulate the color space of a typical CRT monitor. Well, today, how many CRT monitors are out there on the internet today? But originally, sRGB was what everyone chose as the standard for the internet. But now everybody's using LED backlit LCDs and so forth, and they have a much better color gamut than some of the old CRTs. There were some CRTs that had good color gamuts as well. But at any rate, if the importance of these editing profiles, sRGB, Adobe 98, and ProPhoto, are that they are very good spaces to exchange files with other people that have properly calibrated monitors. Now, if they don't have a properly calibrated monitor, you're best to put it in sRGB, because that's kind of the nominal lowest common denominator target we all shoot for. It is the smallest color gamut of the three I've mentioned. The next thing is to work in Adobe Rgb 1998. This is best if you are printing to an inkjet printer or converting to CMYK for publication in a magazine or sending it to a print shop. ProPhoto is the largest of the three, but it's very seldom needed unless you're photographing something that has incredibly saturated color in it. The only thing I can think of that comes close is iridescent butterfly wings or something. The other thing is if you use ProPhoto, it has an enormous color gamut, but that means that if it was 8-bit per color, each jump in the 8 bits is a much larger jump in color than in Adobe 98 or sRGB. So the quantization values jump, and are not as smooth as Adobe 98 or sRGB. So if you use ProPhoto, you want to use it in a 16-bit mode, not an 8-bit mode, to avoid that problem. There are some photographers I know who absolutely swear by ProPhoto. And if you're doing nothing but printing to your own very wide gamut inkjet printer, you can do it and you will have success doing it. It is a very poor color space to map from into CMYK for publications in magazines. So if you're a commercial photographer and you're going to map into CMYK, which is a much smaller color space than Adobe 98, and it's tiny compared to ProPhoto, most software has a better time mapping from Adobe 98 into CMYK. So that's, my word on ProPhoto.
That's really good to know. I mean, sometimes it's just so difficult. All these programs are out there, all the different formats, and how do you know what is the best one to use? And sometimes it's just best to get information from people who have used it.
Right,
like you.
right. Well, those are my, my best shot at guidelines. There are exceptions to all rules.
Of
There are
course.
special cases.
Yeah.
I will not say I've never used ProPhoto. I have for very special things. But most of the time, for my shooting with my Canon 5D Mark II, I map from RAW into Adobe 98 and print from Adobe 98 on my inkjet printer. That's my standard workflow. So, at any rate, yeah.
Seems like it would work fairly well.
Right.
And
there are
if I get into doing it, I'm going to copy you.
Right. Well, there are many other persons in the field that recommend that as well. Now, let me carry on from that and say just a little bit about, I got another, I mentioned about exposed to the right and RGB histograms or brightness histograms on the back of your camera, and told you to be sure and set the contrast at its lowest setting if you want the histogram to be reasonable, because it's a histogram derived from the JPEG image, not from the raw data. So you want to display as wide a dynamic range as possible, and that happens when you turn the contrast in your camera down, contrast setting. But a person wrote in and he said, well, now, wait a minute, Ray. He said, you talked about histograms. Isn't it important to use the RGB histograms and check to be sure that you're not running one of the colors, red, green, or blue, up against the right edge? And if you did that, wouldn't you lose color gamut? And the truth of the matter is, the answer to that is, in most cases, no, you don't lose color gamut. And let me explain why. Other than the very, very light colors, like a very light yellow, and yellow, by the way, is made up of almost 100% red and green, unless you're dealing with a very light saturated color, and again, I think of some iridescent butterfly wing that would be a super bright yellow, the RGB value for a super saturated yellow is near 255 in red and green. However, all the other colors, the darker colors, the reds, the blues, the greens, magenta, cyan, all of those darker colors, the RGB values for them are nowhere near 255 because they're darker colors. Their lightness is not that bright. So to get the full saturated reds, blues, greens, cyans, magentas, the RGB values, if you look at them, if you pick out saturated colors from a color chart in Photoshop and read the RGB values, they're nowhere near 255. So that isn't what is limiting your color gamut. To say that all saturated colors are at 255. What is at 255? Now let me back up and explain that if you look at a color gamut, most of the time it looks like a very irregular fat football. So think of a football stood on end. At the top of the football up here is the whites. At the bottom of the football is the blacks, and they converge. In other words, black converges to black. There's no color when you get to black, and there's no color when you get to white up at the top.
Right.
So when you get to 255, 255, 255, you have white. And when you're up there in that area, there's very little color. So that isn't where your saturated colors exist. Your saturated colors exist in the middle of the football, some a little above the lighter ones and some a little below the middle. The other thing that you need to know is that Adobe Camera Raw does something quite neat. If you have one of the colors, like red, go over 255, it will take the image data from the green and blue and map it into red, so you still have detail in it. But we're talking about the very light whites now. So therefore, clipping of this histogram does not reduce the color gamut in most cases, unless we're talking about a very unusual, very light yellow. So that covers that. And then finally, if you really want to do something to improve the saturation of your colors, I highly recommend checking out the X-Rite Color Checker Passport. The Color Checker Passport, I've got it myself recently. I've been trying it out. I love it. If you use and make the DNG profiles and use it with the Adobe Camera Raw and/or Lightroom, you will find that it definitely increases the saturation and the brilliance of your darker colors. So that pretty well covers it on our questions that came up with regard to color science.
It sounded like you had a lot of good feedback and a lot of really interesting questions based on the 4 modules that you came up with, and there's still more to be discussed, obviously.
Right. Excuse me for just a second. I've got a light that I
thought there was a light that had come on. Yeah, you're very illuminated, or maybe you're illuminating.
It was aimed at the ceiling, and it is turned and is now facing me. Just a moment.
We'll turn the light off and then turn it back on again and then turn it off.
Well, I'm going to have to overhaul my light fixture here, but it's on a pivot, and all during the show, it's just very slowly turned down until it was shooting at me instead of the ceiling, because I was trying to use indirect light
yeah.
here. Any rate,
now you look more comfortable. So let's continue.
Now then, that brings us to the topic of physics across several technologies. And the topic in physics that I'm going to talk about today is aliasing. Okay? We hear that term. We hear about anti-aliasing filters on our camera.
Yep.
We hear about aliasing when people digitize things. What are they talking about? What is this?
It's not the old TV show with Jennifer Garner. No.
So one of the things that's always amazed me as I study physics, and especially as an engineer, you usually have to work in more than one aspect of physics. You may work in audio one day and RF the next, and digitizing and sampling, and you may work in optics the next day.
Right.
And my light's slowly swinging down again. Oh, well, we'll just go on.
We must persevere.
Right. Next week. The first thing I want to explain is if you're trying to tune an instrument, some people have had this experience in their lives. You're trying to tune an instrument, and you play a note on one instrument and you play it on another, and then you're tuning the one instrument. You get a beat note. When it gets very near the same frequency, you get this wow, 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 wow. And, when you get them exactly right, the beat note disappears.
Yep.
And so that is, oddly enough, a form of aliasing. What's happening here is anytime you mix 2 frequencies, whether you're in the RF spectrum or the audio spectrum, you will get usually the sum and the difference of the 2 frequencies. If we go to radio frequency, if we use amplitude modulation, if we had 1,000 kilohertz RF signal and we put a 1 kilohertz audio signal on it, modulating AM, we would, if we looked in the frequency spectrum of the RF, we would get 1,001 kilohertz and 999 kilohertz sidebands. Half of the energy would be at 1,000 if we did a fast Fourier transform, or we looked at it with a spectrum analyzer. We would see half of the energy was in the carrier at 1,000 kilohertz. A quarter of it is in the upper sideband at 1,001 kilohertz, and a quarter of it is in the lower sideband at 999 kilohertz.
All right.
Now, the next area we can take that same thought to is digital sampling. Imagine that we want to do an audio recording and make a CD, an audio CD. A digital audio CD samples at a rate of 44 kilohertz. Why did they choose that frequency? Well, we have to go back to a guy by the name of Nyquist and Nyquist-Shannon sampling theory. What they said in their theory was that if you want to reproduce all of the audio, the quality of the audio and the nuances of the audio, you have to use a sampling frequency that's twice the frequencies that you want to reproduce. So if you want to be able to reproduce any frequency, audio frequency correctly, up to 22 kilohertz, which is where most people's hearing quits.
Right.
If you're 65 years old, it quits earlier than that. But, if you want to be able to reproduce all frequencies from 0 to 22 kilohertz, you have to sample it at 44 kilohertz. Now, if you build a device that use an analog to digital converter, and you start digitizing at 44 kilohertz, you will find out an interesting fact. If there is any signal at all above 22 kilohertz, let's say there was some audio frequency from 30 kilohertz or what have you. Now, you may not be able to hear it, but it might exist in the room, or it might be picked up by the microphone or something that you're recording. If you take that signal and feed it into that analog to digital converter, it will fold back around the 22 kilohertz. And it will fold back into frequencies that you can hear. So if you want to record information up to 22 kilohertz with a 44 kilohertz sampling frequency, you have to use a low-pass filter on the analog signal before you digitize it. And what you try and do is cut off anything above 22 kilohertz so that it doesn't cause this folding. This folding back into frequencies you can hear is called aliasing.
Aliasing. There we go.
So we've tuned instruments and we've gotten beat notes. That's aliasing. That's folding back.
And the digital sampling.
Yeah.
You have aliasing.
Digital sampling, we have aliasing. Now let's apply that thinking to the area of optics and CCDs and CMOS.
Okay.
If you have a chip with no anti-aliasing filter over the CCD chip, if you shoot something that has a pattern that exactly maps, has the same mechanical frequency or spatial frequency.
And so this is a problem with striped shirts, finely striped shirts, and video recording. So if you're striped, that's how the moire pattern
That's
comes
right.
in as a result of the stripes.
And when we talk about spatial frequency, moire patterns are aliasing. It's all the same thing. Okay? So what you can do is you can put in a anti-aliasing filter. All it does, it blurs the image slightly. So that high frequency stuff can't get through.
So you give up, you have a little softness in the image.
Right.
Just a little soft.
And by the way, you can get a lot of the medium format camera backs do not have anti-aliasing filter because the guy is after the very sharpest picture possible at the high end.
Right.
And they take out any moire in the software post-production. But it's an extra step.
Yep.
But the amateur cameras, people don't want to mess with that. They just want to shoot the picture and get a nice picture. So even the Canon 5D Mark II has an anti-aliasing filter. Now, I have the 5D Mark II that has a 22 megapixel chip, and I have the Leaf back from my Hasselblad 22 megapixel chip. But the medium format does not have the anti-aliasing filter. And consequently, if I shoot the right subjects, and I've run into this, I have to take the software and I have to take out the aliasing that I see after the fact. With the 5D, I don't.
Right. The best way to get rid of that is not allow people to wear stripes.
That's right. But you see it on television all the time.
Yeah, all the time.
So
Well,
at any
that's
rate,
fascinating.
all I'm trying to show you is that if you learn about the physics in audio, in RF, in optics, in digitizing, it's all the same stuff, just in a different domain.
Right.
Yeah. And you see these patterns in it over and over.
But it's really all based on frequency. So it's all based on the electromagnetic spectrum in one way or another, and the way that the differences in frequency interact.
Right.
Yeah.
So now
Cool.
next week, if you want to win bar bets, be sure and tune in because I am going to teach you about that wonderfully exciting event that we all saw at the Olympics here in Vancouver. I'm going to talk about the physics of curling. We're going to talk about why curling stones curl and why certain other things I'll explain next week don't curl. And then you can go into the nearest bar, especially if there's a bunch of curlers in there. You can make a bar bet and you'll win every time.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to all the good bar advice. That's good. So next week, we hope that you out there will join us again for yet another episode 65 on curling of Maxwell's House with Ray Maxwell. So thanks, everyone, for listening in today. If you have any questions about anything, you can contact Ray. How do people get in touch with you, Ray?
Ray at twit.tv.
That seems pretty straightforward.
Love to hear from you. If you have suggestions for shows, if you have questions, be sure and drop me a line.
Great. And everyone else, I hope that you will be... Let's see what I'm doing here. Everyone else, I hope that you will be joining us for more on live.twit.tv or more downloadable. You can find the podcasts at the Twit website, twit.tv/MH, I believe, for yours, right? Right, Ray?
That's right.
That's right. So we will be back again next week. And Ray, thank you very much. I'll see you next week.
All righty.